Nice.
Okay, we are live. All right, so we're going to make a start. On behalf of the International Council for Coaching Excellence, welcome to ICCE Connect. We hope everyone is safe and healthy in these difficult times. My name is Sergio Lara Bercial. I am the manager for strategy and development at the ICCE, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Thank you for joining us. More than ever, finding ways to stay connected with our community and the things that we love is extremely important. The ICCE Connect webinars try to facilitate just that by providing an opportunity to continue to learn and connect with others under social distancing measures. Before I introduce the topic of today's webinar and our three amazing speakers, please just quickly let me run you through the ground rules for the webinar. Please keep your camera and your microphone off at all times, so that way we can concentrate on the speakers. Feel free to submit any questions you have on the chat, either through the YouTube facility or through the chat on Zoom. And please, we don't have to agree on anything, but we do have to respect each other. So we are more than happy for you to disagree with anything, or for you to disagree with each other on the chat. But let's make sure that we are respectful of each other, and we make sure that we are all sharing and learning. And finally, feel free to share on social media and get more people involved, or start another discussion on social media. Okay. Now, after those kind of family rules, just to let you know how the webinar is going to run. Each of the three speakers that we have today, and we have three fantastic speakers. So Malcolm Brown, an absolute legend of athletics and triathlon coaching. We have Matt Wilkie from the Irish Rugby Union, Rugby Football Union, and Darah Gregion from High Performance Sport New Zealand. Okay, what's going to happen is each of them will have about 10 minutes to present or speak about the topic, okay, which I will introduce in a minute. And then we will have a time for some questions from myself and from the audience. Today's topic is high performance coach development, supporting a learning culture. Research shows time and again that the very best coaches never stop learning, and that this quality actually sets them apart from the competition. In this webinar, you're going to hear from three different speakers how their organizations are working to develop a learning culture and their own experiences of belonging or trying to create a learning culture. So now we're going to move on to the first speaker. It gives me an absolutely great pleasure to introduce Malcolm Brown, who is an absolute living legend of athletics and triathlon coaching. He's coached for over 30 years, and very interestingly, 25 of them as a volunteer. Either as a team leader or as a personal coach, Malcolm has participated in the last 5 Olympic Games, which is quite some record. And he's been pretty successful. For instance, in Rio, he coached the first, second, third, and fourth place in the men's triathlon, including the Brownlee brothers. He's also the co-founder of the world leading Leeds Triathlon Center in Leeds, obviously. But before that, Malcolm was also in track and field. He was the national endurance coach for Great Britain between 1990 and 2000. Please join me welcoming, give a virtual round of applause to Malcolm Brown. Malcolm, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Serge. And I'm delighted to catch up with you again after the last 6 or 9 months, which have been an interesting time for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, it's great that you had the time to join us today. And Malcolm, I think what we are looking from you here is your experience both as a coach, but also as someone that has managed and tried to support coaches in terms of learning. So I'm going to start with a very open question, really. As a coach, from your own personal experience, what were the most valuable experiences for you in terms of learning? How did you learn to do what you do?
There's probably 2 or 3 sort of categories, really, of experience which have helped me. I think if you bear in mind that by far the majority of my coaching years was as a volunteer coach, and that meant I went to work during the day, rushed out of work, went coaching for a couple of hours, rushed home, saw the family, there wasn't really a lot of time for anything other than the coaching, to be fair. But effectively, what I did is I spent every evening from 8 o'clock after the meal had finished, cleared away, till 10 o'clock, trying to find out why I wasn't a better coach than I was. And majority of that time, it involved reading technical books, reading wider. This was before the internet, obviously, where it wasn't as immediately available. But I went from reading technical books to reading books on leadership, on management, reading other coaches in different sports, Alec Ferguson, Clive Woodward, you name it. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Serial Winning Coaches document, which is
it's a good read. It's a good read.
It was you. I recommend that. So part of it was, I believe in doing things every day if you're going to be good at them. And so I aimed every day, that evening spell, that relaxation, to read. The second area, this might be a bit unusual. I also found that some of the best learnings I had was bringing up my kids, my own children.
Yeah.
Particularly when they were teenagers. And when they're teenagers, you can see their potential, and you want them to achieve that potential and their abilities be fulfilled. But if you go too close to them, they'll probably back away. If you stay on the sidelines, you have to observe some car crashes.
Yeah.
And again, as I say, as a volunteer coach, I found managing those tensions and those issues extremely valuable. And finally, what I really enjoyed doing was, those occasions where I could get together with other coaches and just share experiences. And in the early days, they were mainly around technical stuff, what to do on a Tuesday night with an 800-meter runner who's 16 years of age, run 2:24, whatever. But the older I got, the more the most valuable experiences were about how to handle people. And so those are the three, really, Sergio. Being a parent, reading every day, and talking to other coaches.
I mean, would you say that you naturally had a curious disposition? You were keen to pick up new knowledge and or was that forced upon you? Or
yeah, well, it's definitely. You started off that first question as a coach, what were the experiences? And I would say as a person rather than as a coach, because I'm not a great lover of dropping coach development or anything really onto a person and doing it to them, if you like.
Yeah.
And appraisals and CPD reviews and so on and so forth. Yes, they're necessary, but the essence is what drives the individual to want to be better. And sometimes it's not a good thing, I mean, part of the reason in my case was a feeling that somebody else could be doing this better than you, son.
Yeah.
Basically, I've always been a wee bit of an outsider and always felt that there are other people much more talented and gifted than I am at everything I've ever done in my life. I still feel that now, and I know that because of the amount of trouble I had getting this Zoom to work before we started.
we got there. But that's interesting, really. I mean, you've kind of brought up a number of themes there that are really interesting. I mean, I'm going to start with the last one, really, the idea of you were describing something a little bit like an imposter syndrome, where you don't feel like you should be there or belong there, or that other people might be doing it better than you. And that was a big drive from what we get from you. And that's interesting because in the serial winners study that you referred to before, we found the same. You know,
Mhm.
the absolute top coaches in the world all had this, we called it serial insecurity. So I found that really, really interesting. I don't know if we can, is that something that goes down to your personality, or is there a way that we could maybe instill that little bit of insecurity in coaches so they feel more motivated to learn?
I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm recommending, installing fear and insecurity into people in order for them to behave better. Although with the COVID recently, I just wonder whether to what extent it's been part of the behavioral psychology behind some of the messages that have been given. But my upbringing was, as a single child, so I had to entertain myself a lot. I had to rely on my own resources. I couldn't learn things from other people because there weren't really anybody else in the house. And consequently, always felt a bit of a bystander spectator. And when I played, and I've got coaching qualifications in team sports and group sports, I've always felt very frustrated that the others weren't as serious and trying as hard and wanted to be as good as I wanted to be. I knew after, I was about 24 that if I were going to be a coach, and I was happy eventually to be a coach, it would be in single endeavor areas, as it were. The group was too much for me. I couldn't handle it. I don't know how you guys do it.
We just manage it. We don't do it. But I'm going to ask you one last question before we move on to Matt. But interesting, you mentioned that coach development is not something that you can do to people. That it really is down to the motivation of the individual to learn, and that you're not a big fan of dropping programs onto people. So when you've had that responsibility to create that learning environment for coaches, just quickly, how have you gone about it really? What was your method?
I think there's a couple of things. I'm an educationist at heart, and education means to draw out, grow. And I have seen programs that, superficially have made a difference, but the behaviors, the underlying behaviors of those who've received those programs has either changed very little or not at all. And the fundamental essence of what they needed to learn and what they needed to do was untouched.
Yeah.
And so, and I've been part of the UK Sport Excellent Elite Coach Program. I've advised on that and one thing or another. And I've seen good changes in people. But were they the most important change? Were they the thing that was stopping that coach becoming a super coach or not? And I think if you're looking for that, if you're looking for incremental change, it's maybe not so difficult. If you're looking for fundamental attitudinal behavioral change, then you have to start from where the coach is now and understand why they're doing it, where they're doing it, who they're doing it with, and so on and so forth.
That's really interesting, and I think it's setting up both Matt and Darah quite well, really. Malcolm, I could talk to you for hours, as you know, and as we do sometimes. But really, thanks for that. It's a fantastic way to get us going. And I'm gonna hand over. Well, I'm gonna introduce Matt, and then we're gonna see what Matt has to say about some of these areas. Okay. Thanks a million, Malcolm. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna go over to our second guest. Matt Wilkie is the head of coach development for the Irish Rugby Football Union, and is personally responsible for the continual learning and development of all high performance coaches across all national and provincial professional teams and academies. In addition to this, he is also responsible for setting the strategy and direction of the Community Rugby Coach Development Program. Prior roles include manager of the Queensland Reds Rugby Union team. He's also been a high performance programs coach and development pathways manager in Australia. And he's also a qualified and former practicing physical education teacher. Please welcome Matt. Matt Wilkie. Thanks, Matt. Over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Sergio, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And Malcolm, thank you for your time as well. I was riveted to the screen listening to that. So thank you very much. And everybody, thank you for joining. And I hope everyone is safe wherever you are across the world at the moment. I have a short presentation that I'm just going to share with you as I talk through for the next 10 or 12 minutes around my role and what I do in my role in high performance coach development with the Irish Rugby Football Union. And Karen, if you can just flip me over to hosting duties, I will be able to bring that one up there. Thanks.
Karen, you may have to stop presenting your slide. There you go.
And hopefully we're up and running there. Perfect. So once again, thank you, everybody. And I'll just talk through this as we go. So first of all, I guess it's important to give a little bit of context. And I'm really fortunate in my role to be spending the most of my time working with our high performance coaches. So for those not familiar with rugby union and certainly Irish rugby, who is it that I support? Well, it's all of our coaches working with our national men and women's 15-a-side rugby teams. It's our coaches working with our men and women in the sevens program. And then it's also our professional coaches working within our 4 provincial teams, going as far down as the provincial academies, which is the pinnacle, I suppose, of our elite player development programs. In trying to pull this presentation together, this is the best way that I could represent the process that I go through for everybody who's joined the webinar today. This in itself, I guess, is a bit of a moving feast, and I would consider myself a practitioner in this space who is also continually learning on a daily basis and using a lot of other information, be that academic information, conversation with other coach developers, to be continually evolving my approach and my process to work with these high performance coaches. But what I'm sharing today is essentially what I do at this point in time, and I'm hoping and I'm certain that that will continue to change and evolve as well. First of all, I think it's important just to give clarity exactly what I feel my objective is. And for me, it's as simple as to help coaches get better. And that in its sense is really simple, but at the same time, quite complex and quite broad. And the reason that I like that is because, a little as Malcolm alluded to, it allows me to provide really individual, contextualized, specific information to and support to all of our coaches. I'm going to just take some time now to look at each of these, and in doing so, work my way down through that process. The first step for me is a really key one that we all undertake as coach developers, and that is building a relationship. If we can't overcome that hurdle, then I know from my point of view, and I'll talk about myself in this role, I'm not able to achieve any long-term behavior change, support, or influence on a coach if we don't have an existing relationship. So the first step for me is building that relationship. And I think the key way to do that, and what's been successful for me in this role, is simply giving up my time. Spending time with our coaches, getting to know them as people, and fostering and building a strong relationship. It's the foundation for me on what everything else is then built upon. Step 2 for me then is facilitating some form of self-reflection. And this can be very formal, it can be very informal, structured to unstructured. And really, this is step 2 because it's built on that foundation of the relationship. If I get a feeling from our relationships that a coach likes the formal structured approach to their own development, then I might go down a more formal survey, hard copy self-reflection piece or something like that. In other instances, it would quite simply be asking them to tell me what they feel are good about their coaching behaviors, where they want to improve, or it could just be a coffee conversation where we start to unpack their coaching process and what it is they feel that I could support them with if we were able to keep the relationship going. Once we've facilitated that initial idea around that self-reflection, the next step for me is the most critical one, and it's raising self-awareness in the coaches that I deal with. I feel that I'm very fortunate in our sport of rugby union that we have a strong existing culture of analysis in terms of how we coach our players. And with that comes video analysis. So one of the key components to my current process in working with coaches is to video them in action. And I find that's been really, really successful for me because that is the best way to give them a true indication of how they're coaching and how they are perceived for their players. Because regardless of who we are and how we operate, our perception can and often is a little bit different to the reality. And so raising self-awareness for me is about giving coaches a true reflection of how they come across to the people they're dealing with, their players, their multidisciplinary staff, their peers, whoever it might be. And just to give you an example of how I go about doing this, I mentioned video for me is really important, and I focus from a rugby context on 4 key areas. The first one that I do for our coaches is capture them in a team meeting environment. So as you can see here, this is just a screenshot of the type of video footage that I would capture and then provide back to our high performance coaches. So this is a team meeting taking place. In this instance, I was able to capture 2 views of the team meeting, one from the front of the room and one from the back. I sync these up using our video analysis system and then provide that back to the coach at a later date, which I'll touch on. But team meetings for me is an important one. It's a process that our coaches spend a lot of time in, and it's one where they can continually improve because they tend to, from a rugby point of view, be less aware of what they do in a meeting environment as opposed to on pitch. Not surprisingly then, the second area that we'd look to capture this then is that training environment. Because rugby is a sport where training is also videoed, it's very simple for me to have my own camera and my own devices, film a coach in action and overlay that footage and sync it up to what has been captured from a team training point of view. In doing this, I also utilize just a simple radio microphone, which means that I can be picking up the audio for the coach as well as their visuals. And that allows that additional layer of self-reflection and then co-evaluation, which we'll speak about. The other areas that I feel are important to capture coaches are in-game. Not a lot of education and training from a national governing body point of view or from NSOs tend to focus heavily on what a coach does during game events. And so for me, it's an important one to be able to shine the light on for our coaches. And then going hand in hand with that is capturing how they work at halftime in terms of, again, their messaging, their delivering, their communication, their body language. For those coaches that are comfortable, the other way that I work with them to raise their self-awareness is gathering player feedback. So at the end of a training session or a team meeting, for example, if I'm there and present, I'll quite often grab 2, 3, 6 players and just ask them what their key takeaway messages were. That for me just gives some more awareness in terms of information from the playing group that I can then feed back to our coaches that I'm working with at a later stage. So once all that information has been collected, I then provide that back to the coach. So it might be a matter of us collecting all of those examples that I've seen. It may be one. In the instance where we haven't been able to capture video, quite often a device like an iPhone can be really useful in just recording audio. Or if we're not using any technology, then it's just a matter of myself taking some observation notes. But I provide that information back to our high performance coaches first and foremost, because I want them to go through an evaluation process before we go down that process together. So if I have provided footage to them, I give them the appropriate time they then need based on their commitments as a coach to be able to view that footage and make their own observations. One thing I just wanted to make sure I raised here for everybody is that I'm deliberately not providing too much of a structured framework to coaches to be self-evaluating their videos on. For me, it's really, really insightful to see what process they do use, what they give attention to and what they don't. Typically, the only framework I would provide would be have a look at the video, tell me what you like in terms of your coaching behavior, and tell me if you identify anything you feel that could be done better. So by keeping it simple, it allows them to go in the direction that they feel is most important. But then for me, I get a real critical insight into what they're aware of as a coach and maybe where some blind spots might be. While they're taking the time to view that footage, it could be a matter of a week or two until that gets complete. In the background, I suppose, then I'm also drawing my own observations, going back over that footage where appropriate, coding it, cutting clips to be able to share with them at a later date. And I always make the effort to be able to provide to them my thoughts in written format so that then they've got an opportunity to have a document that they can reflect on at another point in time as well. The duration of this document depends on how much time I've spent with them, what the interaction has been like. It may have been a one-off session through to a whole week. It might be reflecting on a coaching group. It could be reflecting on an individual. And importantly for me in this document, I break it into a couple of key components. The first thing I do is just provide observations. And for me, the observations is providing factually accurate information based on what was seen or what was done. So things that can't really be disputed and are not opinionated. They're essentially accurate in black and white. What I then do, and I think you might be able to view on the right-hand side of the screen here, is provide some feedback then that I put under the title of considerations, questions, and comments. For me personally, this has been a really, really effective way to make some suggestions to the coaches. I'm very, very aware that the time I spend with our coaches is limited, and there is often a very good reason that has led them to behave or coach in a certain way on that particular day or that certain session that maybe I'm just not privy to. So I am really cautious not to be too direct in suggesting this is what you need or must be doing as a coach, because I don't have all of the background information. So what I try to do is to provide them with questions as a stimulus to challenge them to maybe evaluate why they've done something one way or as a way to try to do something different, or considerations, which could be, have you thought about doing it this way? Or here is an alternative approach I've seen done elsewhere. Importantly though, that report is never provided to any of the coaches I work with before we have a conversation. So we come together, we have a conversation after they've watched the video. In that conversation, I do the best I can to pull a lot of information from them, get a good feeling of where they're at, and then I share my observations back to them. Surprisingly, and quite pleasingly, these often overlap, and we get a fairly mutual understanding of what was good and what could be better. There's always going to be 10–15% of differing opinions through there, and that's a really important section as well, because that's where I can shine a light in what might be a blind spot for that coach and their individual coaching behaviours. The final step in the process for me then with our coaches here in Ireland is the co-creation of a continual learning plan. And for me, co-creation there is really, really important. And we heard Malcolm speaking earlier around his preferred styles in terms of continually learning and improving. And I think as coach developers, we've got to be really attuned and aware of that. So for me, I don't have any set formula in mind on what a good continual learning plan might look like, because it comes down to individuals based on their preferences, their time availability, sometimes budgets, their interest and their drive as well. And what I've come to learn in developing these plans is undoubtedly that a bespoke approach is best. Individualized, personalized, context specific. Some coaches will wish to pursue formal education and training. Others will prefer to be network with coaches and have conversations. Others just want to revisit some video capture, for example, or as we can see, and again, as Malcolm alluded to, just like some reading, be it academic or books to dive into. A recent thing I have made sure that I've done though, is commit that plan to a learning and development plan. And this is a modified form that I was fortunate to receive from John Alder from the English Institute of Sport. So I'll acknowledge him that the majority of this template came from him. This has been really successful for me recently, purely because it's putting some definitive timelines around some objectives that we co-agree are important, and then also whose responsibility it is to achieve those and who can be used in a supporting sort of role. The final loop then, back from my point of view, is the arrow on the right-hand side. And the stronger the relationship, the more frequently I can keep looping back and beginning this process again with our coaches. Off the back of that co-created learning plan, there are things that are identified there that we then drive back into an element of self-reflection, self-awareness, and so the loop continues. And to give an example of that recently that I've been able to do with one of our coaches, I'm in my 4th season working with the current head coach of the Irish under-20s team, who's also heavily involved with some underage programs and academies. And this season, one of the key priorities for this coach was working on his in-game communications. So if we picture back to our diagram, off an idea of wanting to be continually improving in match day comms, we made sure that we captured this coach in-game recently, and then I took the time to code every piece of communication that he had during each half of that game. I then provided that back to him following our process. He then took some time to view it, came to me with ideas. I came back to him in that conversation with what I had seen and thought, and now we have another plan in place that is enabling him to continually improve this behavior and practice as he goes through the rest of his coaching season, which hopefully we'll return to sooner rather than later. So I guess in summary from me, everybody, that's just a very brief overview of the process that I currently go through to, as I mentioned at the very top of the slide, help my coaches get better. This is dynamic, this is fluid. Will it be applicable to every context and every environment? Probably not. The last point I would like to raise is that even for me, with this process in place, it's a very, very different experience for every individual coach that I work with. We might spend more time on one step, we might skip a step. how we go about achieving each of these is also very different. If there's one thing that I've learnt recently in working with high performance coaches, it's that the more individual and personalized I can be in the support that I provide them, the more effective that support appears to be for them. And as a result, the better likelihood of us working together to improve their coaching behavior. Thank you, Sergio.
Okay, Matt, I mean, there was so much packed in there, really, both from a, if you want, from a theoretical perspective in the background, but also in terms of your application on a day-to-day. Fascinating, really. Thank you so much. And with that, we're going to move to our third speaker. Okay, so Darah Sheridan is the. We're actually going back and forth. We were joking about this before. So Matt is from Australia, working in Ireland. Darah is from Ireland, working in New Zealand. Okay, so we're going back and forth. Yeah, we clocking the air miles, really. Darah Sheridan is the manager for high performance coaching for High Performance Sport New Zealand. He leads a coaching team of 5 consultants who provide support to 14 national sport organizations and 90 high performance coaches. Prior to moving to New Zealand, Darah spent 10 years working with the Irish Institute of Sport. During his period, he led a range of key initiatives involving athlete and coach development. In 2016, if he wasn't busy enough, he completed his PhD. Darah is also a UEFA accredited football coach and coached the Irish Paralympic football team to a European medal in 2010. And he was also a professional football player from 1998 to 2004. Please welcome Darah Sheridan. Darah, thank you very much for being here with us. It's over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to connect with you all this evening. I did a little check on chat there, and it turns out there are 13 different nations connecting at the moment, which is a pretty phenomenal stat. So I want to thank everyone for giving up their time to be part of this, and it's great to be in the company of both Malcolm, an Olympic medal winning coach, which I honor you and congratulations for that, and obviously Matt as well, whom I know, who just I guess presented a real masterclass insight in terms of what a rigorous feedback process looks like, and an incredible service for Irish rugby coaches to get. I'm just going to try and share my screen here. So maybe Karen, if you can help me to have the permission to do that, that'd be really, really useful, just as I'm about to share my screen.
Sorry, I think Matt, have you could you make me host again, please?
Apologies, no problems. No problems.
Thank you.
No probs. And I just also want to shout out to two colleagues in Ireland, Declan O'Leary and David Passmore, who played an impact on my journey and my development. So I just want to recognize both of those guys that are on the call this evening as well. So
yeah, Karen, I think that is done.
Okay.
You may just need to stop share screening the current slide that's up there for Darah.
Yeah, cool, that works. Thanks, guys. Cool.
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess just to provide a little bit of context around this, guys, I arrived in New Zealand 18 months ago, really, I guess, wanting to visit the pinnacle of my profession. And I guess a huge thing that motivates me about my sense of profession is about helping people. And in this case, obviously growing and developing coaches to be world class at what they do. I was quite privileged prior to arriving to New Zealand to really, I guess, develop and grow in an Irish system that went through a rapid phase of development over a period of a decade, where I would have collaborated with people like Declan and David Passmore in the development of a whole range of initiatives around elite high performance coach development. This evening, what I want to do is just give you a bit of distinct New Zealand culture in the context of how we create place, community, and sustainable learning systems and structures around coaches. And I guess the first half of the presentation will really kind of zone in on what we currently do. And the second half of the presentation then will kind of zone in on what we're aspiring to do into the future. I guess some lessons learned from my own perspective as a coach, as a learner, and as a facilitator of coach learning. these would be, I guess, a set of learnings or principles that would guide and inform how I like to think about learning in the context of culture. So I think the point regarding relevance is really, really important. When you are supporting a coach, the learning has got to be relevant to context, the situation that the coach is in. The coach is, I guess, got to be intrinsically motivated to want to get better at what they do. And I think if you do achieve, you know, relevance to them in their context, it has a huge impact on intrinsic motivation. I think variety is a really important point as well in the context of there are many different ways in which a human being can learn and form experience and develop knowledge. So given the fact that variety plays a key role, it's important that, I guess, the points through which coaches learn are facilitated and aided above and beyond just a small number of learning sources. It's really, really important to have a diversified learning set of sources for coaches to connect with. Experience is a really important one as well. Here in New Zealand, we're quite strong on simulation and bringing training experiences to life that are relevant to the context and that simulate actual challenge and the emotion and the experience of that challenge. And from my experience in the Irish context with work that we've done through simulation-based education in our National Police Force, it was the highest rated coaching support within our coaching community at the time. I think, you know, Matt has given a wonderful example regarding feedback. You know, there's always a difference between what you are doing and what you think you're doing. And if you're getting really, really good feedback, it gives you an opportunity to make that reconciliation between those two things. And then finally, a learning culture there should be responsiveness. Context should be acting on the learner to respond either with questions, with curiosity, in order to seek out that new knowledge that can lead to better practice. So they're just, I guess, some ideas from my perspective regarding what I've maybe experienced that has worked in terms of enabling and sustaining a learning culture. Just in terms of New Zealand context, guys, I just wanted to give you a sense as to, as an organization, we're 120 strong. We have a budget of $66 million per year. We work into 14 sports, which is over 500 athletes, and I guess a coaching community that's made up of 90 employed coaches. And when you look at the learning infrastructure in New Zealand, it is a great place to learn, in my mind. There are multiple sources through which we can aid a coach to learn at an individual level in tandem with a sport, learning themselves and putting proper systems and structures in place for their coaches and their employees to learn on the job and in the job as the experiences are arising. And these are just some of the sources that I would have talked about, from Prime Minister scholarships, which would provide significant funding every year to enable individualized coach learning, to an annual performance summit where we task coaches to be, I guess, the teachers at that summit, sharing case studies around on-the-ground reality, to themed workshops which relate to current challenges or issues in the context that are currently facing coaches. So I guess an example of that would be, I guess, how legalized coaching practices now become, duty of care, and the role and the requirements of coaches, I guess, to adhere to workplace related legislation and obligations from a legal perspective, being just one example of a themed workshop that we're currently planning into the future. I guess it's kind of at this point really where for an Irishman to be speaking about an Indigenous culture, there's a bit of a risk in that I guess I don't come across as a tourist. I want to come across as a learner of something new, which I've come to really, really value and appreciate. And I guess when you put New Zealand into context, 700 years ago, some native people from Eastern Polynesia arrived in New Zealand and settled, and they were the Maori people. And I guess part of, I guess, their worldview is that Tikanga Maori, their customs and their ways are very, very relational. And how they settle in the form of community focal points around the country. There's over 700 of what are called maraes, or settlements, where these communities form. On those maraes, there are what are called ferries, which is the house you see in the background here, with a facilitator standing in front of that, who's engaging with our coaches. And I guess Tikanga Maori describes the customs and the practices around a whole host of Indigenous practices One of the practices is called pofari, which basically means how we weave people together to learn and connect and encounter difference across groups. So last October, through a key member of my team, whose name is Christian Penny, who was previously the CEO of Toifakari, which is New Zealand's top performing arts school, took over our Coach Accelerator program. And with him, one of the main reasons why we recruited him was he brought a whole new perspective, not only from the world of performing arts, where he spent a number of years leading a national scene in New Zealand, both at home and abroad, but also the way in which he cohered a really, really interesting learning culture within the school that he led for a number of years through the application of Tikanga Māori practices, frameworks, and principles. So back in October, we gathered a number of our coaches at this marae, which is a focal point for how communities gather. Inside that is the ferry, which is the house which is listed in the background. And inside this house, I guess, it kind of acts as a map, a learning map. And I guess in the house, you can see that there are 3 poles. The back wall actually represents the point of stillness, or a person's sense of purpose. The middle pole in the room represents, I guess, a person's source of wellness, what feeds you, what gives you joy. And the last pole, I guess, before you leave the room, is really around your point of application, which is having reflected on your intention, your purpose, and your sources of wellness, what practices are you going to bring to life in the world outside of the house? And this notion, or this concept of 2 different worlds. So the world inside the house represents you, your practice, your purpose, your intention, your source of wellness. And the world outside of that is where you ultimately bring that to life in terms of how you act, how you interact, how you perform, how you challenge, and how you meet the challenges that are faced around you in terms of your daily practice. So picture this: we 12 coaches inside this ferry, learning together and learning this technology inside this house, which is over 2,000 years old. Part of actually getting into the house, there's a whole sequence of engagement around that. And one of the things that we try to impart onto the coaches is how to learn that sequence of engagement. And this is the sequence. And I guess the sequence, I guess, is all about decision making and responding to context. And the 3 main phases in the engagement, starting with orientation and invitation, leading to information and reflection, and then growing on from there to growing identity and relationship. And I've just highlighted 4 steps in the sequence, which are pretty significant. And I guess when you think of getting ready to learn, it's probably one of the things that I've learned the most from experiencing this is, do we work hard enough to get ready to learn, to prime ourselves for learning? And that can be in the context of a group setting where we're working hard, I guess, to truly understand who's in the room, what are the differences, what are the risks in terms of how we might meet one another today. So the matataki is one of those key phases where we awaken that potential that's in the room for future learning to occur. Building on from that, one of the key things that in creating this setting in between a group of people is the notion of creating clarity regarding intention and purpose. And that's openly stated, agreed, and it provides a really powerful basis for a weave to happen within the group, where having achieved that connection around intention and purpose, we can then accelerate that learning connection. And the last phase is really around Wananga, which is this notion of having a learning conversation, which is so open that people build and layer curiosities off one another, share insights to the point where after that Wananga phase, people have developed shared knowledge and a shared practice that ultimately is for the benefit of everybody in the group. So right now, this is one of the key, I guess, frameworks and practices that we're trying to, I guess, create as a unique andragogy for how we support coaches to build connection, meaning, and learning in the communities that they actually lead, within which there are athletes, there are service providers, and there are a range of key others. And I guess having a responsibility to lead that, but also to be a learner in that community as well. So maybe just to conclude, what I kind of wanted to do here this evening was really kind of extend our thinking around learning, community, and engagement by looking at some of the indigenous culture and wisdoms and practices that are already there in our setting. And when I look at the, I guess, 13 countries that are online, what is distinctly culturally unique about your country that could be used to drive and inform how people leverage difference, how people can set up more meaningful encounters around how we learn, how we share, how we collaborate, with a view to having an impact in the world that's, I guess, ultimately outside of that ferry or that house that we've already described earlier on. So I guess when I look at that point regarding place, it's got to be functional, it's got to be meaningful, and it's got to be memorable. When you go to a marae and you spend time in you know, this ancient settlement with the people and the community that live there and reside there, it's incredibly meaningful to be on that settlement, listening to them, the histories, the local topography, and the story and the significance and how rooted, I guess, that sense of place actually is. For me, when I look back at experiences around learning, far too long, we don't obsess well enough regarding the place through which we locate the learning, so that learning can take place in a way that is meaningful and a way that is memorable. I think when I look at the process steps here are tried and tested over 2,000 years, and the steps are actually pretty transparent, and they can be learned, and they are robust. And a number of the steps aren't actually easy, in that you end up calling out things in the context or dynamics that could ultimately impact learning, and you draw out, I guess, that sense of context that is in the room. And I guess finally, the processes are quite progressive, and that it does lead to ultimate connection, which then leads to sharing and the exchange of knowledge and the leveraging of difference. I guess the final point regarding the people element, because of the place in the process, it cultures or nurtures people to be curious and to be responsive and to be courageous around one another. And I think when we bring coaching groups together like that, having the right place, the right process, and the right people, I guess, in the room who are willing and open to learning new ways to connect and learn together, it creates a powerful accelerator for learning in the context of a team or a wider organization. So that's kind of my offering this evening from New Zealand. Is very much we're figuring out how to take a beautiful form of indigenous wisdom, how to codify it into a high performance setting so that it is distinctly New Zealand, so that we can ultimately sustain and elevate the quality of our learning cultures and practices as a wider community. Thank you.
Darah, that was absolutely fascinating. I really feel like a kid in a candy shop, really, after listening to the three of you today. Right, so after the three presentations, really, and looking at the same issue, really, through three different lenses, what we're going to do now is, over the last few months, or the last 18 months, the ICCE ran a working group called the High Performance Coaching Working Group. And this group conducted an analysis or a consultation around what works in high performance coach development. Okay, so before we start asking questions from me and from the audience, I'm going to hand over back to Matt, who was a member of that group, and Matt's just going to briefly take us through the headline findings from this report, and then we'll get into the conversation. Okay, Matt, back over to you.
Yes, Sergio, again, thank you very much. And Karen, if you can jump out of that, I might throw this document up briefly. I'm just going to take a couple of moments just to go over the document, which I believe has been shared with everybody on the call here today, and hopefully you can now see this on the screen. I was very fortunate over the duration of the last, well, during 2019, essentially, and I'll go straight to the bottom, to work with this core group of people through a variety of individual conversations, small working group conversations, and sequential interactions to unpack and unpick with them what they felt was effective in the practice of high performance coach development. And that group was very insightful, and I felt very privileged to be able to talk to them continuously and learn from them as well. because we had a great representation from a variety of different sports, different countries, universities, Olympic sports, etc., etc. And without spending too much time on this, because this document has been shared, these were what we were able to pull out that were consistent factors around what was currently effective in this idea of the development of high performance coaches. And a lot of this has been echoed through the presentations that we've heard today, which is great as well. But you can see through there some of the key messages that we pulled out from the working groups was the idea that personalized individual support is consistently needed. The awareness of the increased self-awareness, the importance around coach-athlete relationships, and learning that was occurring in the coach's workplace was found to be most effective as well. Something that I think ties in quite closely to what Darah was just speaking to us about. Although we were able to identify what we felt was best practice, there was also some challenges that came with that. And a lot of them for us working in this space, they do revolve around resource, be that human resource, financial resource. So knowing what is best practice, but then being able to deliver upon that is a challenge for those of us working within organizations where our role is a responsibility to work with these coaches as frequently as we can. One of the biggest personal benefits I have working with Ireland is the country is very small. It enables me to get around very quickly. The practices and processes that I have in place here just wouldn't necessarily be applicable in other countries due to geographic constraints. And then finally, the group unpacked a little bit around what some future directions might be. And once again, this can be read in your own time, but having a look at the broader well-being and care for our coaches in that high performance space was something that came through really loud and clear. And also, as these great webinars are doing, increasing that collaboration across sports, because what is effective is a focus on coaching process, not just the technical and tactical aspects of each individual sport. So Sergio, I might leave it there and we can potentially take some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, Matt, might be worth leaving that slide on, if you don't mind sharing that again.
Okay, certainly. I'll get that one back up in a moment.
Yeah. Okay. Like I said, three fantastic presentations, really lots of food for thought, lots of interaction really on both chats, on YouTube and on Zoom. I'm not going to be able to get through all the questions, but I've picked up a couple of themes really to discuss based on the questions, okay? And the first theme that was quite strong in the chat was the idea of, okay, so in developing high performance coaches, what's the role of formal education? Because everything we are presenting is much more individualized. What do you see the role of formal education to be? Can formal education also work for high performance coaches? And if so, how? Any takers from the three of you?
Just briefly, I guess, Sergio, my response would be that it can and does play a really important role for the right coaches and for the right individuals. I think that higher level education is providing opportunities to engage coaches who are interested in that space in a unique way to a level that potentially I can't provide myself. I don't think it's a one-stop shop and not suitable for everybody, but it does, from a practitioner point of view, play an important role for me as one of the suites of offerings for our high performance coaches.
Thanks, Matt. Darah, what's your take from your perspective on this?
Yeah, it's really interesting because New Zealand in the last 20 years have moved away from a formal coach education culture, more towards one that's more socially orientated. I think formal learning is better placed at a novice stage where people don't know what they don't know. They don't have a knowledge base to practice to the point where they've got proven experience and confidence to know what they don't know. So I would certainly see for coaches starting out who've got novice tendencies, it's really important to build that base of knowledge around the performance sciences, particularly performance psychology, skill acquisition. I think these are fundamental knowledge sets. Whereas when I look at a coach like Malcolm, no doubt, given the experience you have, non-formal and informal learning with your peers relative to you and your context is what you need because you've already built and established that base of knowledge. So I guess in summary, Sergio, I would say that it's more relevant to coaches who are at the early stage of their career, and it's pretty critical if I'm being honest.
Thanks, Darah. And that's something that resonates quite strongly with the research, really, that the role of the different types of education really changes as you develop as a coach, and also, as Matt said, based on your personal preferences. And that kind of links back to Malcolm. You were talking at the beginning about your three favorite, or the three ways in which you learn. One being your reading, self-driven reading, then sharing with other coaches. But I want you actually to explore a bit more in this context. You said that you learned a lot to become a coach from your interaction with your children, with bringing up your children. And I guess apart from your children, I was also thinking when you said that, well, and you also had some pretty high-profile jobs within universities. What's the role of this prior learning, or if you want, learning that happens outside the sport arena for high-performance coaches? What was it like in your case? And then I will come back to Darah and Matt to see if they've seen these also in the coaches they work with.
Yeah, well, thanks. And those two presentations were fantastic, and I really enjoyed them. So thanks, Matt and Darah. First of all, I would agree that different forms of learning at different stages in your coaching career are very appropriate. The formal learning did play a part in my earlier coaching career. So, for example, endurance sport, which is what I've been involved in, very strongly dependent on exercise physiology, biomechanics. And there's a lot of pseudoscience and not such good science, as well as some great science in that area. So I enrolled on an Open University course on evaluating research. And it was a year-long course in the 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock slot that I was telling you about. After work and after coaching, I was doing 10 hours a week on that, and it enabled me to cut the wheat from the chaff in terms of sports science. What is gold standard research, and what is just good research, but you can't rely. So that was important, and so I think Sergio, the forms of learning do change. Now, regarding the children, the question you asked me, I was blessed or cursed with very, very different children, in that one was a conformist, would do what he was told, and the other, she was a non-conformist, divergent thinker. Dyed her hair green at the age of 8.
Are they watching?
and so on and so forth. Very, very not able to concentrate, but very sparky, very, very artistic, and trying to within the home environment provide the opportunities to thrive for very, very different people. Takes me back to the points that Darah and Matt was saying about the individualization and the importance of the context in which you are learning and developing people. That interaction, if you like, between society, the sort of things, and legacy, the sorts of things that Darah was very strongly talking about and Matt touched on at the end there, and the individual, providing the opportunity for, and the constraints for further development, but need to be acknowledged, Yeah. So I can't provide any answers here. I can only describe the nature of the problem, as it were.
Yeah, but for example, in your other roles, in your day-to-day job, what you learned from there impacted on your coaching, or what you learned from coaching impacted on your work, or both ways?
Yeah, well, I think the work, I eventually became head of a department in university, and I had 60 or 70 people, to manage, and then as I was coaching, my coaching went from an individual hobby to suddenly the national governing body saying, well, look, here's your nutritionist, and here's your physiologist, and here's your sports scientist, and here's your coach developer. That was the worst one, guys. And this person's going to make you a better coach, and suddenly you had a lot of relationships to deal with and some to manage. And managing in my university career and learning about HR, finance, marketing, how to conduct meetings, how to conduct development of staff, I think definitely helped as coaching became more professionalized, Olympic coaching in the UK, because it's only in the last 20 years that we've had the sort of resource to create full-time opportunities through the English Institute and UK Sport and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I feel that many coaches struggle because they are asked to speak the language of the medic, then speak the language of the physiotherapist, then speak the language of the nutritionist, and then the physiologist and the performance scientist. And that's a big task.
Yeah. Matt, any comments on this last section really? How does this play in your environment, this idea of both the learning that happens outside the sport environment, but also, like Malcolm is saying now, the fact that we're asking coaches to do things that we're not prepared for?
Yes, Sergio, probably two things come to mind, and I'll sort of keep it practical to what I experience here at the moment. Number one is I don't think you can, nor should you, separate the person and the coach, if that makes sense, because what is happening in the life for that person, or what has happened in their life leading up to this point in time, will influence them as a coach, good, bad, or indifferent. If I look at that specifically for me, we have a lot of coaches who transition from a playing background. So they have a good understanding of rugby from a technical, tactical, player execution point of view, but maybe lack the knowledge and understanding around the coaching process bit. Conversely, another entry point for us into coaching is from an education and teaching background. They would be on the flip side. So they would have strong pedagogical knowledge, but maybe lack some of the higher end detail around the game of rugby itself. So I think as a coach developer, or at least for me, I've got to be all encompassing in what they are as a person and how that influences them at this point in time in where they've been able to get to as a coach, but then also how they can, continue to grow as a coach.
Thank you. And I mean, it is really, I mean, one of the other themes in the questions really is around this idea of, and Malcolm mentioned it earlier on, right? That we can't really, coach development is not something that you do to someone, okay? And kind of the theme on the chat was, well, how do we present this to the governing bodies or to the coaches? How do we convince people to buy into what we do, right? We can't really force them to learn, right? We can. So Darah, in your case in New Zealand, really, how is that process of selling, getting the buy-in from the organization and the coaches to buy into this?
Yeah, listen, I think journeying with the coach, like the ultimate intervention in my mind is the relationship, and I think Matt highlighted that in a significant way. If a coach is isolated or disconnected from key others or other sources of learning, we have a bit of a problem. And so the human connection, the connection with a coach developer isn't necessarily about what that one person will do with the coach in the first instance, but what that relationship can lead to is who that coach developer is connected in with and other sources of learning. And if that person is skilled and experienced in their job, their big focus will be on sustaining and holding that relationship with the coach, really understanding them, their context, their previous experience of learning, what they liked, what they didn't like, and no two relationships are the same. So I think that principle of, the most important intervention is the relationship from a support perspective. I think that's really, really significant. From that, the keys to the person, the context, their need, and then on the other side, the developer then can flow the resource, whatever that is, only when the relationship has been developed. The problem with that is to scale that is a challenge, because I'd imagine, Matt, like there's a certain number of relationships where you can really have quality connection and deliver quality support at that level. And that's a big challenge for systems, to have enough people with the experience and the capacity to do that.
Yeah, Matt, you want to come back on that in terms of the implications of trying to build relationships with a lot of people?
Oh, most definitely. You know, it's one of the most restricting factors that I find. And, you know, the other part for people in my positions who might be on the call, and it's a personal challenge for me, is that element of succession planning, or that evolution of the next step. Because I think a lot of what I do with our coaches is so personal in relation to the relationship we have, and that one-on-one back and forth. It can be difficult to articulate that or quantify that, to, you know, be able to upskill others in the same sort of way or approach. But then also for some people, I know it's a challenge, and this came through in those working groups, to quantify the time and resource that we spend in high performance coach development, because it's so difficult to articulate an outcome. And in organizations that are under financial pressure, quite often people will be asked to go, can you show me the return on investment that you're doing in this coach development space? And unfortunately, I don't really have an answer, because it is very hard. I think it does have to be qualitative. It does have to be through stories to have that impact. But, you know, what we do is constrained through the resource that we have, and primarily it is time and reach, I feel.
Can I just interrupt here, Sergio?
Go on, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I completely concur with Darah and Matt on the resource limitations impacting on what can be done. I think, therefore, I think there's a question to be asked: is, can we ask the coach to take on responsibility for their own development, which I'm sure people would want them to do, but also to look for the resource outside of that, which the NGB or the club are able to provide so to do? Because otherwise it seems to me that the coach developer is, their impact is necessarily with a small group of people, because it does depend on the quality, as has been said just now, of that relationship. The trust and the communication and the openness has to be developed. And you can't do that with a lot of people. So I just feel that just as we like athletes, you know, the best athletes I've coached are the ones who've really been the easiest to coach. They've taken responsibility for their training, for their performance. And I've felt more like a sort of occasional guidance to them rather than a coach. Earlier in careers and with other athletes, it's been much more of a, you know, a sort of controlled process that we'd understand as coaching. I just wonder whether there's something in there about saying to coaches, you have a responsibility for developing yourself.
Yeah, and that's a clear message, really, that well, for me, it's a bit of a combination, right? There's that old saying of you can take the horse to water, but you can't make it drink it. But also at times we have to also find a way to get them to be thirsty, or to be, if they don't like water, we maybe give them milkshake or milk or something. I mean, for me, hearing you three now, the last 5 minutes, really, one thing that's coming through is, and Matt said, you know, one big problem is that we don't have enough coach developers with the skills to do this. We published a paper last year evaluating one of our programs, really, where we were very surprised, because what came through as the strongest mechanism for the coaches to learn was that they liked the coach developers. They found the coach developers personable, they found them relatable, they found them that they genuinely cared about them. So it wasn't all the other stuff, the pedagogical approaches or the theories that it was actually that they enjoyed being there. And that kind of, for some of them that had never been exposed to anything like this, that has sparked something in them, that drive to learn. So like you say, it's asking them to have that responsibility, but also facilitating that development in them, that they develop that need to learn somehow, that we can open a door for them somehow with the relationship, really, as Matt said. So Matt, what happens when you're working with a coach one-to-one and that door doesn't open. What happens when, have you ever had a problem with any of the relationships? And obviously without mentioning any names, but how do you go about that? How do you solve that problem?
Oh, certainly, Sergio, you know what I mean? And in that relationship part, for some, because it is personable, it clicks very quickly. And for others, it takes a longer period of time. I guess in my context again, and that's all I can talk about, I actually feel very fortunate that if there is somebody in our system who isn't necessarily enthusiastic to engage, then I don't have to be forcing myself upon them. So I think that's really beneficial for me, obviously, but it's also, I think, is the right thing to do, because if someone's not open to support and facilitation to get better, then it is essentially a waste of time. So that doesn't mean that me personally, I would give up straight away. It's about trying to find a way to support the coach in a way that they see most valuable first and foremost. And if you can meet some of their early initial needs, I think that is a massive step to building the trust, getting a bit more vulnerability to enable greater work to take place. So sometimes for me, it's about almost looking at it as getting some easy wins by, you know, providing some support in a way that is immediate to their needs. And through that, a relationship can grow. But certainly you come across coaches, as everybody on this webinar will, that are just not in their stage of their own personal professional career, that they want to be engaging in this sort of activity. And I think to a certain extent, we've got to be respectful of that. And I know personally, I can easily be investing that time into other people who are looking for that support.
Yeah, and interestingly, really, we talk about different stages of development of the coach, right? And one of the questions really on the chat was around, it didn't quite say this, right? But it sounded like, how do we protect young coaches from information overload? There is so much out there now, whereas, you know, for me, when I started coaching 25 years ago, there was hardly any information out there. Malcolm, I'm not saying anything about your age, okay? But when you mentioned before, when you started, it was relatively information starved, because there wasn't the internet, there was no YouTube, there was no. But at the moment, there's a lot of that, right? And how do we help young coaches, or any coach really? They don't have to be young, because we're all guilty of this, of falling for the last fad, or trying to go from one thing to another. What's your, from your experience dealing with coaches, guys, how much of a problem is this information overload? Is it a problem?
Well, I think the previous problem that you mentioned back in the day was a bigger issue, where the information was extremely scarce, and I'd prefer the current problem of having to separate the wheat from the chaff to you know, not having any wheat at all, which was a circumstance back in the day. And but what it did do, it made you seek out sources of information, travel to them, spend time with them. You know, I'm talking in my case with coaches of great athletes like Steve Ovett and others, a guy called Harry Wilson, and really put some effort in to that. But then you began to, you know, you then, as I say, found, well, how do I discriminate between this information and that information? Once I've got two different schools of thought on a particular issue. Well, you know, we'd have to discuss the specifics of that, but yes, I find that many coaches would prefer to talk to a more senior and experienced coach who they respect for that sort of guidance than do some formal learning and try to become a sports scientist, for instance, you know. Mm-hmm. But the danger of that is, you know, some of those senior coaches themselves have maybe not done much learning for a while.
Yeah.
I think there's a bit of a rite of passage. So when you balance off the tension between what I know and what I've experienced, and if those two things are typically low, and you're obsessed about becoming something, it's a dangerous recipe whereby I think people can fall into that instant desire for a recipe book of some description. Like, you know, at the end of the day, to make decisions in a complex environment, you need to build the knowledge and gain the experience in parallel and in tandem. So the biggest advice I would have, and I know it's one of the audience have just kind of posed that question, is learn how to learn. Learn how to learn. Understand the apprenticeship from where you are to ultimately becoming an expert. Be clear on what those expertise actually look like. Define it in action. Study it. Look at the difference between where you are and where that other expert is, and then build a bridge in how you build your learning focus and agenda, I guess, ultimately around that. But that's a real challenge, because typically the learner doesn't know what they know, and they can get frustrated by that, and they don't spend enough time truly understanding the journey or the passage and the requirement of going through that apprenticeship experience. And I think it typically works really well, where we're now beginning to see a pattern in New Zealand where we're trying to pair up, and this is really important move as well to facilitate depth and retention around an expert coach, where we're appointing apprentice coaches to work with senior level master coaches to study them and their craft. It's an accelerator for a coach to develop quicker, but ultimately more effectively in the presence of somebody who's demonstrating expert practice on a daily basis. And there's loads of literature around expertise, how people form judgments, what they look at, being able to understand patterns, being able to read context, being able to understand system. These are the critical capabilities that I don't see universities teaching. And these are the critical capabilities for the real world of high performance coaching. And that's one of the challenges I have with universities is they're not necessarily prepared to update their curriculums to make them even more real world orientated. And then when coaches finish these coaching science degrees, they're high on theory and low on field skills around the reality. And that's where they get burnt up and get disillusioned, I think. Yeah.
All right, guys. Look, I could talk to you for hours, but we've gone well over the 1 hour mark. We're on an hour and 20 minutes already. And I know you're busy people. I'm going to let you go, but before we finish, I'm going to thank first all the people that tuned in between YouTube and the chat and Zoom. We've got nearly 200 people from all over the world. I'm going to thank you guys because it's been absolutely fascinating. Like I said, I could listen to you for hours on end. Thank you so much, Mark, Darah, and Matt. I hope we can have another go at this in the future. But thank you for your contributions. And with that, I'm just going to wish everybody that they stay safe and healthy. Let them know that there will be more webinars coming through, coming down the chute. That this webinar will be, as of tomorrow, available on YouTube. If anybody wants to rewatch it or to share it with their colleagues.